Hello, this is Bill Storage, and I'm going to talk about some work I did aimed at unraveling part of the history of this ancient marble portrait of Augustus Caesar. It involves photogrammetry, laser scanning, custom software development, statistical analysis, and input from some very learned scholars in the fields of archaeology and art history. Over the years, scholars have concluded that this marble head, the Getty Augustus on display at the Getty Villa in Malibu, was, like a dozen other portraits of Augustus, recarved from an earlier portrait of Caligula, Augustus's great-grandson, after Caligula was murdered. I'll show that despite some evidence supporting this conclusion, it simply cannot be correct. Evidence cited by at least 4 experts who've examined this piece include reshaping of its mouth in order to correct Caligula's receding lower lip, reshaping Caligula's weak chin, claw chisel marks from removal of Caligula's shag or mullet haircut from the nape of Augustus's neck. They also observed that the current sculpture still retains Caligula's wide eyes and hollow temples, traits not found in original marble portraits of Augustus. The chisel marks reported by the scholars really are there, but we'll propose another reason for them a bit later. I see little evidence of reshaping of the mouth, however, but more importantly, I disagree that such reworking of the mouth and chin would be needed to transform Caligula into Augustus. That Caligula had a weak chin is accepted in Roman sculpture studies, although this may indicate an unconscious acceptance of physiognomic judgments made by ancient historians who wanted us to accept their negative views of the murdered ruler. But it isn't true. Compared to Augustus, Caligula in sculpture did not have a weak chin. We can now say this with confidence because my wife, Laura Maish, and I have taken detailed measurements of a large number of portraits of both men. These measurements show that Caligula's chin is generally stronger than Augustus's, and Augustus's upper lip projects more than Caligula's. In anthropometric terms, weak chin could refer either to mandibular short face, that is, the mandible is too short along the vertical axis, or to a form of mandibular hypoplasia where the mandible height is normal, but it is either relatively small along the x-axis as shown here, or is abnormally retroposed. Regardless of what you call it or what specific condition it describes, the data says that Augustus has it more than Caligula, so we can't be seeing remnants of a condition that Caligula didn't have in the first place. To avoid subjective comparisons of the faces, we adopted the approach used by craniofacial surgeons. We selected a group of facial landmarks and wrote a computer program, which we called FaceMap, that allows us to identify the facial landmarks with simple mouse clicks. It records the coordinates of the facial landmarks in a database from which facial proportions and statistical calculations are made. This eliminates the tedious and error-prone job of measuring distances, calculating ratios, averages, and standard deviations. This was handy, since we've taken over 30,000 photos of ancient Roman heads. We only use our own photos for measurements because we found that most of those in image libraries were shot at too close a distance to prevent the effects of perspective, which can introduce a considerable amount of error. As I introduce some perspective effects here, similar to what you get by using shorter, wider angle lenses, you might notice a considerable similarity to shots from the classic catalogs of Roman portraits. With the use of wide-angle mobile phone-type cameras, viewers are even more accustomed to perspective effects in facial portraits. But on an SLR camera, we find that we need lenses in the 200 to 400 millimeter range to avoid errors in calculations. For the Getty Augustus and a Caligula portrait of the so-called primary Caligula type, the Getty Museum kindly allowed us, along with Dr. John Polini, Professor of Classical Art and Archaeology at USC, to use a Polhemus Scorpion scanner to digitize several portraits. This handheld scanner has the novel ability to build a wireframe of the subject in real time without ever touching the surface of the sculpture and without needing to use a turntable. Before we scanned the heads, John had seen our anthropometric data and agreed that the accepted Caligula hypothesis for the origin of Getty Augustus seemed highly unlikely. In fact, he then immediately proposed an alternate origin, one that now seems almost certainly correct, but it took manipulation of the 3D models obtained by laser scanning to confirm that. After scanning the heads, I used the RapidForm XOR reverse engineering software to clean up the scanning data and to produce watertight models of the heads. I then used XOR to scale and superimpose the heads, effectively placing the Augustus head inside the Caligula head at a scale that would leave minimal material between the two. Remember that the proposed model of recarving involves retention of much of the original portrait, including eyes, temples, back of the head, and part of the nose and mouth. It's easy enough to fit Augustus inside Caligula in this way, but manipulating the superimposed figures immediately reveals a major problem. When the eyeballs are aligned, much of the face of an Augustus head of any workable size protrudes through that of Caligula. In other words, an artist would have had to have added material to Caligula to get the Getty Augustus. The backs of the heads line up poorly too. To carve this Augustus from a standard Caligula, the entire back of Caligula's head would have been removed, resulting in no trace of removal of Caligula's longer locks. As a final test of the Caligula hypothesis, we took a look at what such an original Caligula would have to have looked like in order to support the proposed recarving model. Here we've deformed a Caligula head from the New York Met to just fit over top the Getty Augustus. This results in a Caligula that doesn't look like any known original. The same thing happens when we use the Getty Caligula. This diagram shows the significant changes required for such a transformation. Using FaceMap, I analyzed the relevant facial proportions of all the heads of Caligula and Augustus that we've photographed and found that the mean differences between the relevant proportions for each ruler are large compared to the standard deviation of a proportion for the group of specimens of either subject. So if not Caligula, then who was it? John Pollini's answer to this puzzle was that it was Augustus, in an earlier portrait type. In 27 BC, Octavian first took the name Augustus and a new portrait type appeared, the so-called prima porta type, of which the Getty Augustus is an example. This portrait type included a few significant changes from type 4, the previous type, particularly in the shape of the hair locks over the forehead. Pollini proposed that a subtype of the Octavian Augustus type 4 portrait, known as the Stuttgart type, would likely fit the bill. Our first attempt at matching up the frontal and profile views of the heads resulted in an amazingly good fit, including the mouth, eyes, ears, and back of the head. Interesting given the tall Getty Augustus head and its unusual occipital arch. The main problem in this matchup is that the Getty Augustus has longer hair coming down over his forehead. So once again, we appear to be faced with the problem that an artist doing the recarving would have had to add material to the primary portrait to get the resulting configuration. A close-up view of the superimposed profiles provides a likely solution. To get longer forehead locks, the second sculptor carved away some of the original forehead in order to extend the original hairline. This clever solution was carried out, but with a few side effects that were noticed by scholars over the years and were interpreted as evidence of a Caligula original. We can thus reasonably conclude that, rather than being recarved from a portrait of Caligula after his death in 41 AD, the Getty Augustus was an update done for Octavian, now Augustus, sometime shortly after 27 BC. In the last few decades, scholars have become aware that a large number of ancient portraits were reworked in ancient times, either as a form of condemnation of unworthy rulers or simply for reasons of economics and expediency. Recarving presents quite a puzzle to the historian investigating the details of such a transformation. The analysis techniques we've investigated here, which could barely be conceived of a few decades ago, may shed considerable new light on the topic.